Okay, good morning, good afternoon, and maybe even if you're in a different part of the world, we are delighted to be having our second in a gene therapy webinar series with you today. And I realise that we've got quite a few people joining online. I want to let everybody know that this session is being recorded. We do have the slides that will be available for download on our website, partnersforaccess.com. If you do have any questions or any queries, then just so what we're going to do today, and I'm delighted to have two of our that are joining me. And so we have Isabella and Prasoon Sabedi, and Ed is going to be talking to us about the payer's perspective when it comes to gene therapy in the US. Now, Ed actually is representing his own consultancy, his bio consultancy. And one of the reasons that Ed is wonderful to join us today is very much presenting the perspective. And Ed used to be Vice President within Aetna, as I think as many people will know, is a very important insurance provider in the US, covering just shy of, I think, 40 million lives there. So very important when it comes to policy and strategy from a gene therapy perspective in the US. I'm also delighted to be able to introduce Prasoon Sabedi as well. Prasoon is representing his own personal opinion. Prasoon joins us as a senior director within Pfizer, and specifically is in the Center for Health System Innovation and Leadership. Now, Prasoon's been doing quite a bit of work recently, not just on cell and gene therapies, but looking within the rare disease area. And certainly Pfizer have been active, I think, probably since sort of middle of 2016 with one of their major acquisitions in gene therapy. And I would anticipate are going to be a major player moving forward in gene therapy. So great to have everybody on the line today. And let me just explain a little bit about why we're doing this before we kick off. So Partners for Access, for those people who are not aware of us, Partners for Access, we are global specialists in orphan drug access, and we work with many companies around the world, and one of the things that we're very keen to do is to make sure that we strike an equilibrium in the world of rare diseases. And that really means having a fair deal for everybody. So often, you know, we hear being talked about for the patient, and clearly at the end of the day, that's what we're all doing it for. But it also has to be a world where it also works for the physician to be able to have the most appropriate treatment for the physician. It also needs to work for the payer. We need to have therapies that are affordable for the payer. And then lastly as well, we shouldn't forget the pharmaceutical industry who are producing and developing these therapies. And it also needs to be able to work for the pharmaceutical company. And one of the things that we're very keen on in Partners for Access is making sure that we have a voice in looking to strike that equilibrium. So with that in mind, one of the things that we are often involved in orphan drugs is gene therapy. And we wanted to do a gene therapy webinar series to really help everybody understand, well, what are some of the lessons that we are learning so far when it comes to cell and gene therapy. And we started off late last year with a webinar that was really trying to address what actually is gene therapy, how can we best categorize it, what are some of the myths associated with it, what can it do and what can it not do. And today what we're going to do is really going to be digging into the US market, and we're going to be exploring some of the lessons we are currently learning from the gene therapies that have been approved. And then over the next few weeks, what we'll do is we'll do a similar session in Europe, looking at some of the lessons that have been learned in Europe. And one of the things that I'd like to just, I'm sat here in London at the moment as part of this webinar, and we have this phrase in London: if you're looking to get a bus, you can be waiting for ages and ages, and all of a sudden 3 will come at once. And it's a little bit similar to I would say, the gene therapy situation in the US. Certainly in Europe, we had Glybera, first of all, that was regulatory approved in 2012. It wasn't until 2017 that the US market had regulatory approval for some cell and gene therapies. And literally within the space of 5 months, you got 3 at once, a little bit like a London bus there, really. So what we're going to be doing today is exploring some of the implications, some of the challenges, and some of the opportunities that have arisen by the learnings of 3 of those gene therapies, cell and gene therapies. And also I would say as well, as we look forward into 2018, the environment very much is evolving in the US. We've got obviously the CMS, some deals have been struck with CMS, insurance companies as well, insurance providers are setting their own deals up, and even looking at the hospital settings and the hospital billing is something else that potentially is challenging with some of the therapies that require surgical application. So the market very much hasn't necessarily been ready for gene therapy, and now there are many changes that need to occur in order for it to be commercially successful. So without any further ado, what I would like to do is to start off by one of the poll questions. And we have a few poll questions today, and the idea of these poll questions is very much to get the audience involved and get the audience involved in really understanding some of your thoughts when it comes to gene therapies. We'll have some time at the end of the session today with the speakers to talk through some of the poll results. And there'll be 3 questions as we go throughout the webinar today. So what you should see on the side of your screen shortly is you'll see coming up some options to be able to answer this question in terms of whether you think these therapies are priced appropriately. Now, clearly, we've only had a few of them in the US so far in terms of the pricing, and certainly both Ed and Prasoon will come on to talk about some of the costs of those. So you'll see you should be able to see a polling and a voting question, and there are 3 potential answers to this first question. So the first answer is yes, the second answer is well, no, they're far too expensive, and the third answer is well, I'm not entirely sure. So have a think about those. There is a time period to be able to answer that, so we've got 1 minute to be able to answer those questions, and as I say, at the end of that time, so there's another 30 seconds left to answer the question. At the end of the session, what we'll do is that we'll have some time to talk about them. So we've got 13 seconds left. If people haven't answered the question, looks as if it's rather polarized at the moment in terms of yes or don't know. Not many people are actually saying it's too expensive, which is quite interesting, and we'll come on to talk about that later. So let me see. I think we are nearly done with the questions. So I think what we can do now is we can move on, and I would like to introduce Ed. As I mentioned, Ed is representing the payer perspective today and has some very interesting and thought-provoking insights that he would like to share with us. So let me just move on to Ed, if we can. I'm just going to pass you control, Ed, so that you're able to move through the slides.
Sophie, thank you very much, and it's very nice to be speaking to everyone here today. This is certainly a very interesting and important topic for everyone, whether you're in the development business or in manufacturing or on the payer side, but especially from a human point of view, and being able to to change the lives of people who suffer from a variety of problems, whether they're oncology or inherited genetic problems. And so it's really quite exciting time that we live in terms of the opportunity here. So let's get the slides to advance here. Just a moment. There's one. Okay. So in the U.S., we now have 3 approved things that we need to talk about: Kymriah, Yescarta, which are CAR-T cellular therapies, and Luxturna, which is a true gene therapy for patients. And then I'm going to mention here Spinraza because it's an expensive therapy for an inborn disorder. And right now it looks like I'm not moving the slides, so Sophie, perhaps if you could just move them for me. Great. So why are we looking at these? Well, they're certainly getting a lot of coverage, but more importantly, it's because it's very promising for patients. But at the same time, there's a really high price tag on these. And also there's a great deal of investment, from investors, from pharmaceutical firms, from others, putting money and time and effort, many, many years into developing these. And so the cost is high, but it has the promise of making a difference for patients. There are certainly important policy discussions occurring, across the globe in every country, basically, which is how do we assign value, what prices should we be willing to pay, and how will insurance cover these? So on our next slide, we just need to kind of put this into a sort of perspective here. So not suggesting that we know one price is better than another or something like that, but what we have here is 3 one-time therapies: Luxturna, Kymriah, and Yescarta, and then 2 therapies that are ongoing as chronic treatments. And here's their current price tags. So Luxturna, one-time price is approximately $150,000. Spinraza, the first-year price is $750,000, but then it goes down. It costs less in subsequent years. Solaris is also a chronic treatment, and it's just over $500,000 for yearly treatment. And then Kymriah, $475,000, and Yescarta, $373,000 per year. And then there have been some quality calculations for some of these, and these are reported by the Institute for Clinical Effectiveness Research, ICER, here in the United States, and they found that Kymriah and Yescarta were cost-effective at a threshold of less than $150,000 per quality, but not so with Spinraza and not so with Luxturna. So you can see we're sort of, we've got expensive therapies, but some of these therapies are ongoing and are more expensive than the one-time therapies. But even so, we're not seeing sort of a comparable quality across, all of these. And certainly at this point, the cost-effectiveness analysis is tilted towards the CAR-T therapies. Next slide, please. So we have both public and private payers in the United States, and we have a large number of them, and we don't have a centralized HTA or other authority, although we have the non-governmental, not-for-profit called ICER, which produces reports that are being read and passed around in the U.S. But on the public side, we have the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, which oversees Medicare, Medicaid, and a number of other important regulatory and policy things here in the U.S. And we also have commercial plans, my former plan Aetna, which has over 23 million members, Humana with somewhere around 12 million members, mostly in Medicare programs, and some of these others, are fairly important. But also we have a large number of regional plans, mostly called Blue Cross Blue Shield plans, which have a large number of patients in a given region. Next slide, please. And so the public programs, the Medicare program is for everybody in the United States who reaches age 65, so 65 and older. It also covers certain individuals who are disabled, and for people who have end-stage renal disease, mostly patients going for transplant or are chronically on dialysis. And this is a federal program. People contribute to it, and then it's paid for out of particular sets of federal funds. Medicaid is a federal state cooperative program, so every state has a Medicaid program. It's in part funded by the federal government, so there are federal rules, but states also have leeway in what and how they will cover how many individuals can be in it. And generally, Medicaid is for low-income individuals and families who are at the poverty level or below it in terms of income or within about 150% of it if they have some income over the poverty level. Included in these federal state programs is the state children's insurance program, which is specifically for children whose families make too much money to be in Medicaid, but they're not able to obtain insurance. The commercial side, we have a lot of people who are insured through their employers, and large employers can be self-insured. We call this ERISA, which is just the name of the federal a law that allows for this and governs them, so they are not governed by state but by federal regulation. They're a small group and private insurance, so insurance is purchased by either an individual or a family or by a small employer directly from one of the big insurance companies we just mentioned. And then there are state-level exchanges which are run via federal regulation and were established by the Affordable Care Act of several years ago. And these have provided coverage to a fairly large number of people who otherwise don't have access through employers. Next slide, please. So the CMS, in addition to being the administrator of the Medicare program and co-administrator with the states and the Medicaid programs, also does a number of things which establish sort of policy across the U.S. And importantly in this discussion is that they are in charge of establishing the Medicaid, what's known as the Medicaid best price. And the Medicaid best price is basically a mandatory discount off of the listed price of a medication that will be used in the Medicaid program. And a large number of patients with problems that will be treated by gene therapy are in the Medicaid program. More than a third of children in the United States are in a federally funded or state-funded health insurance program. And for children with chronic diseases, it's actually higher because many of these diseases have impoverished the family because their parents are not able to work full-time and other related employment issues. So the Medicaid best price, generally you can think of it as being a 23% discount off of the list price. And that's just to play ball with the Medicaid program. But the big issue is that if you have established, programs for rebates, discounts, or perhaps an outcomes-based contract with other entities, if you go below the Medicaid best price, then you reset that Medicaid best price lower. And that's going to be an important thing when we talk about some alternative payment and pricing mechanisms. There's also a thing called the average sale price, which is basically for drugs that are generally considered buy and bill or otherwise go through the medical benefit through a provider and then to the patient, and the provider bills the health plan. This average sale price is monitored by the U.S. government and published on a quarterly basis. Again, if you have a discount arrangement, that can impact this average sale price and actually cause a price that the drug can be purchased at to be lower. So commercial payers in the U.S., there's sort of a large number of them, just a handful of big ones, but then quite a lot of the smaller regional plans, as I mentioned. And there's basically three ways to look at what commercial payers do. They establish a benefit design. Within that, they have clinical policies to determine how things are covered. And then there's actually some kind of payment. A claim is made to the payer by a provider, by a drug company, by someone, and then there has to be a payment mechanism. So benefit design is really about what's the promise to the member of the health plan, and generally they have both a medical benefit and a pharmacy benefit. Almost all plans have both, but they may be administered by different groups. So you might have a health plan administering medical benefits, and you may have a pharmacy benefit manager managing the pharmacy benefits, and they attempt to coordinate these sorts of issues. Generally speaking, gene and cell therapy, because it's delivered in a healthcare setting by a healthcare provider, will be covered under the medical benefit. There are some plans that currently specifically exclude gene and cell therapy from coverage, but this is going to change over time. Basically, they just didn't want to be the first ones to cover it and have everybody flock to their plan, but the states will basically step in and regulate this and tell them that under medical necessity rules they're going to need to cover these things. Clinical policy is basically the decision that something is not experimental and therefore is coverable, and under what conditions will you be covering it. So this is generally based on the indications that are granted by the Food and Drug Administration. It's modified by clinical trial inclusion and exclusion criteria. So you might have a broad label for everybody with spinal SMA, if you only had type 1 or type 2 patients in your trial, then the payer may exclude the other types and just cover those. So the label is one thing, but what coverages may be defined differently based on trial results, inclusion, exclusion criteria. And then the actual payment is, who is going to bill for a particular treatment and how much. For example, outpatient drugs that are administered in a medical setting are billed generally at the average sale price ASP plus, and for Medicare programs it's 6%, and for commercial plans it could be as high as 10%. But if it's given inpatient, then it might be a multiple of the ASP and not depending on the contracts. So this markup can be significant and drives actually a lot of decision making. So the payment mechanisms here, the current model, and the most common way that pharmaceuticals are covered under the medical benefit is that the drug is actually purchased by the physician or other provider and then billed to the health plan for each individual patient. And as I said, this is usually on an ASP plus basis. However, for hospital inpatient and also for hospital outpatient. So if you're receiving care through a center that's actually owned by a hospital, some contracts allow for the hospital to create whatever charge it wants, and then they get paid a percentage of that charge. This can end up meaning that the drugs can actually cost a couple of times what the ASP is, and so payers try to avoid that. And certainly they don't want to see that with a very expensive therapy, a gene therapy, a CAR T. Inpatient payments, though, generally are based on a rate that's established for the diagnosis and sometimes for the procedure that the patient might need to undergo. This is called a diagnostic related group, or DRG. We have DRGs for things like bone marrow transplant, chemotherapy infusion, and all sorts of other things. And so at this point, if a gene or a cellular therapy was covered under a particular DRG that exists now, then the hospital would have to absorb the cost of the new therapy into what they're paid, well, they're just not going to get paid enough. They don't have a margin like many DRGs might pay, you know, $30 or $40 or $50,000 for a hospitalization. It's nowhere near enough to cover these expensive new therapies. So, so we need a new model here. We need to, and so there's been a lot of proposals for things like direct payment between the insurer and the manufacturer, which reduces this opportunity for markup. Would then set up an opportunity for other mechanisms like payment over time or other innovative payment mechanisms like payments based on reaching certain clinical milestones, and avoid some of these problems with this DRG-based payment system. So some of the innovative payments, so the reasons for innovative payments here is that one, there can be sort of a big number of patients or a bigger number of patients waiting for treatment in the first year or two of therapy. So, you know, this would be basically treating the prevalence of a condition. So this is for, you know, conditions that aren't immediately fatal, and so if you're looking at thalassemia, sickle cell disease, hemophilia, and things like that, there's a large number of patients who are being treated now with current therapies who could be candidates for gene therapy. So, you know, so there's a huge budget issue if all of those patients or many of those patients seek treatment in the first year or two. This is what happened with hepatitis C. You know, a lot of people would argue that hepatitis C treatments were pretty expensive on an individual basis, but the biggest problem was that there were a lot of patients with hepatitis C waiting for treatment. And then there's a high single treatment cost, and so there's concern here that what happens if for a particular patient the treatment fails. And so that would be an opportunity for outcomes-based payment, which is where the payment is adjusted in some way. But because we may not know that it's a failure or a success for a while, there's been an opportunity or thought to merge these two ideas together, to pay over time, which reduces the budget burden to start with, especially if there's a bunch of patients waiting, but also it gives you an opportunity to see if the patients responded to therapy, and then if they haven't, you can cut off payment to the manufacturer, and if they have responded, then you would keep on paying. Most of the mechanisms right now, there are outcomes-based contracts in the U.S. Most of the mechanisms for those are with rebates. Rebates are legal. You can do rebates in many different settings, but they do have an impact on prices like ASP. And so, so in terms of policy and utilization management and deciding, you know, who gets a particular therapy, the U.S. payers have some controls, but they're sort of limited. They sort of use them for everything. There's nothing new for gene and cell therapy, but basically a, you know, just sort of a retooling of the kit that's available at the moment. So the primary goal is defining the right patient population and getting them the intervention at the right time. So you first, of course, want to look at diagnosis. Does the patient fit, you know, the diagnostic category? Has there been confirmation of the diagnosis through appropriate testing and those sorts of things? Level of severity might matter, or it might be the type of disease. So some diseases, you know, have early onset and some have late onset. So you're looking at, you know, either some subcategory of the disease or whether they are very severe. Site of care can make a difference. Basically, is it going to be delivered outpatient or inpatient? If it's going to be outpatient, can you avoid a medical center or hospital outpatient department where the prices will be marked up in some instances? So basically trying to get to a less expensive site of care if it's possible. I mean, there's some of these where you have to do it inpatient. And then there may be other criteria involved, you know, has patient tried and failed other therapies? If you're looking at hemophilia, for example, their status vis-a-vis inhibitors would matter a lot in whether or not you would want to do gene therapy. So here's an example of a policy. This policy is publicly available on the Aetna website. like other clinical policies at Aetna. And so basically, the first bullet point, this is the same as the label. What is it treating? That's the diagnosis. Who is it treating? Patients older than a year and less than 65. This reflects who was in the clinical trials. There needs to be confirmation via genetic testing, and that is also mentioned in the label. And it's also mentioned in the label that the patient should have a significant number of viable retinal cells, because if the cells are already dead, they're not coming back regardless of the gene therapy. But the label leaves it open how you make this determination, and so Aetna has chosen to take some information from the clinical trials and turn that into criteria for determining if the patient has enough viable retinal cells. And then there will be a site of care policy. Right now for Spinraza, for example, the site of care policy says that it has to be administered in a setting with a pediatric neurologist where these patients are generally cared for. And so, so we can see that the policy actually is this, pretty much reflects what happened in either the clinical trial or the indication received from the Food and Drug Administration. So clinical trial inclusion, exclusion, and who you enroll really matters a lot in payment these days. Medicare reimbursement, not really too different from the commercial health plans. Everybody in Medicare has Part A. It's just automatic as soon as you enroll. Part A covers inpatient hospital costs. Now, they're paid on the DRG, which we discussed, and so DRGs generally aren't big enough to assume the cost of a new technology. If a hospital decides to buy a different kind of sponge for surgery and other stuff, that's their problem. They try to fit it into their budget based on their DRGs. But, if they have to purchase an expensive medication or device for the patient, then that means that they might lose money on that particular patient. So there is a thing called a new therapy add-on program or payment, which is administered by CMS, and this is where a manufacturer can ask for an exception to the DRG, and there's a formula where up to 50% of the value of the DRG can be added on as a payment for allowing the new technology. Now, given what the DRGs cover, even if you've got a DRG for a bone marrow, it's still only up to a couple $100,000. So you can see 50% of that is not going to cover the cost of the gene or cell therapy. So so we need some other payment mechanisms. Part B is something that people who have Medicare can sign up for. They actually have to pay a monthly premium for this, and this is outpatient services and drugs that are delivered in an outpatient healthcare setting, and about a third of Medicare patients are in what is called Medicare Advantage, and 2/3 are in the traditional fee-for-service Medicare. So traditional fee-for-service Medicare is paid directly by the federal government through a third party, and their job is just to pay the claims. They basically check to make sure it's not a fraudulent claim, and they pay it. And a third of the patients are in a Medicare Advantage plan, which is administered by a private company. It could be a for-profit or not-for-profit. And those patients can receive some extra benefits, and those plans actually do set out their criteria for what they're going to cover and what they're not going to cover, but they pretty much have to cover most things that are covered by Part B, fee-for-service. Right now, Medicare is in talks with Novartis, it's in talks with Spark, it's in talks with others around the coverage of CAR-T and gene therapies. Right now, there are no known outcomes-based or innovative contracts with Medicare. And one of the things we have to remember about Medicare is that CMS is not allowed to negotiate drug prices. And so there are negotiations, but the negotiations are around the mechanisms for getting paid, for how to deal with Medicaid best price changes based on outcomes-based contracts, how to deal with ASP based on outcomes-based contracts. They're not around the actual cost of the drug. CMS would have to be authorized by Congress to do that. So at this point, these things are really about policy and how to deal with pricing mechanisms and not with the actual price of the medication. Adding on to this, there's just recently been a development where in Massachusetts and in New York, Medicaid programs, they have told hospitals that are in the Medicaid programs that they can cover, that they can do gene and cell therapies, but they will present a bill to the state that's identical to what they paid, so actual acquisition cost. And then if there is an outcome-based contract available, they expect the hospital to negotiate for that, but any rebates, discounts, or savings that are accumulated as a result of those contracts will go directly to the state and do not accrue to the hospital. So the hospital does not have liability for the cost of the product, the gene or cell product, but they also don't get anything back from those negotiations. And so, Kymriah and these things are sort of still moving. There's the publicly available information is somewhat limited, but patients are definitely being treated. The number of patients appears to be going up who are receiving this. Some of these patients are in a phase 4 study, but some of these patients are actually receiving it as a paid benefit. Some payers have excluded CAR-T, but not from all of their policies, just certain ones, and so there does appear to be payment going on. But this outcomes-based pricing, which is there's no payment if the patient doesn't respond at 30 days, appears to still be sort of an ongoing negotiation with CMS, although some plans have announced that they have outcomes-based contracts for Kymriah. And so, Medicare and Advantage plans at this point, they want to pay this ASP plus 6, but it's not clear exactly how much they're paying at this point. Next slide, please. That's it. Here we go. Okay, so what are the takeaways from this? So this is an evolving thing here in the U.S., and we are looking at, these payment over time and outcomes-based payment mechanisms, but we're having trouble because of their impact on these sort of federal pricing controls. There will certainly be prior authorization and other policy things that are done by both commercial and Medicare and Medicaid plans. These will certainly be stricter than the FDA indications. And also there will be restrictions to certain providers and centers, centers of excellence, transplant centers, or other sorts of centers. Innovative contracts are being considered, but the impact on ASP and best price is not yet known, and how to avoid that impact, we don't know. We have not yet in the U.S. adopted an approach for determining value. That is, we don't generally apply cost effectiveness, although ICER reports cost effectiveness as dollars for quality adjusted life years. There's only a small number of plans that use this for any kind of coverage decision, and certainly they have not applied to do that for gene and cell therapy. So the establishment of value in that way has not been done. There's a lot of discussion now, especially since ISPOR has published its report on cost effectiveness and on value frameworks. State and federal governments have not yet weighed in to say that there should be universal or required coverage for gene and cell therapies, but we expect to start hearing from states, especially those states where some plans have said that they won't cover them, and we're waiting to see what happens when a patient needs Luxturna and appeals to the state for coverage from their health plan. So I want to thank you very much, and I look forward to questions at the end of the session.
Thank you very much, Ed. That's fantastic. Thank you very much. There's so much to talk about there, so many insights that you've given us. I think it's going to take a while for everybody to digest that. So what we do, why don't we go to the next poll question? And hopefully everybody can see that on the screen. So what we want to do here is looking at the main challenges for pharmaceutical companies
on gene therapy reimbursement. Now, we've obviously got quite a few answers here. You can have multiple answers if you think that it's more than one. The first one is price, so being able to arrive at a valuation in the first place. Second one is establishing the clinical benefits, and obviously what Ed was talking about there in terms of the inclusion and the exclusion criteria are very important. Also looking at the societal benefits, and Prasoon's going to come on and talk about ISA and some of the sort of maybe the broader picture rather than just the clinical benefits. Access to patients is another one, none of the above, or all of the above. So have a think about that and decide which one is most appropriate. And if you can just click on those, and I'll give you a few seconds to go through that. And then, as I mentioned, what we'll do at the end of the session is that we'll talk about what specifically is going to be some of the key challenges, certainly from a payer perspective, but also a pharmaceutical perspective. So what I'm going to do now, I'm very conscious that we've got 20 minutes left, and I do want Prasoon to be able to share some of his thoughts from a manufacturer's perspective. I'd like to move on to Prasoon's slides. So if we can get up Prasoon's slides. And I think, Prasoon, probably what's easiest if we drive through these slides. So hopefully everybody can hear you.
Yep. Hello, everybody. My name is Prasoon Subedi. I'm going to talk to you a little bit today. As Ed noted, we are still in a state of flux in terms of the lessons being learned here. So I'm going to try to take the perspective of developers. And Sophie, if you go to the next slide. As Sophie noted, I am an employee of Pfizer, but my role is a bit unique and different. I sit in the center that looks at health systems and how they are evolving over time. So I am not directly involved in any of the gene therapy or cell therapy programs that Sophie mentioned that Pfizer is engaged in. But I think about how the evolving landscape, particularly in the U.S., will affect the pricing and reimbursement of those therapies and try to think about the policy changes that might be needed to improve the environment for us. So let's begin by talking a little bit about kind of how the environment has changed. I think it's really dramatic how things have changed over the past decade. It wasn't so long ago that the biopharmaceutical industry was being a bit chastised for its incremental innovation. We were being critiqued that, we were bringing a lot of Me Too products to market and that we really needed to be a bit more bold and invest in kind of breakthrough therapies. That was the primary criticism that I remember, being levied on us not too long ago. Here we are in 2018. The landscape has changed directly and decidedly, and now we have a very different challenge that we're facing, one that really focuses on affordability and the fact that, we have delivered innovation. We are bringing, as Ed noted, really important breakthroughs to patients. But now there's questions about how the health system can absorb those and whether the health care system can absorb those. So if we go to the next slide, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about how this has evolved and why I think we are where we are and how I think we're responding. So it's important to recognize, and I think we talk about this all in our own individual groups, that the hepatitis C therapies that came out in 2015, 2016 really started this debate about, what can we afford? What is a cure? What kind of data do we need to prove a cure? How do we develop a price for a cure? How do we figure out who we're going to treat? How do we approach some of the different pricing and reimbursement options that we may want to develop, given that these are non-traditional products? And these are important questions that were raised that we continue to struggle with. And I think in the examples that we've seen with Kymriah and Luxturna, we've seen companies respond to them in different ways. But the genesis does go back to the Hep C therapies. If we go to the next slide, since that 2015-2016 discussion and since the evolution of the new therapies, I think there's three key themes that are dominating the landscape for biopharmaceutical manufacturers. And those are the optics of price, meaning, irrespective of value, irrespective of budget, list price matters. And we'll talk a little bit about why and how it matters. Second is the challenge of affordability, that even if you come to a price that seems reasonable given the value that you're delivering, there are some issues in terms of just budgets and insurers in the U.S. having, particularly state insurers and government insurers, having enough money to provide coverage for not only your therapy, but the other therapies that they have to provide coverage for. And then finally, as Ed noted, the final question is one around value. The U.S. is still very much in a state of determining how we're going to assess value in the U.S. And it's a very open question, I think a really interesting one that we should all be paying very close attention to as it continues to evolve. So let's start with the optics of price. And if we go to the next slide. I think the current debate that's happening in the U.S. around drug pricing is critically important because for developers of breakthrough therapies where, you're bringing a lot of clinical benefit and, aligned with a paradigm that with high value, there should be a high price given that it's reflective of the value that you're delivering, we're in a bit of a sticky situation. We have an ongoing existing debate about incremental value in the biopharmaceutical industry and its link to price. So if you think about kind of existing products, the debates that we've had, let's say in oncology, about additional months of survival for a given treatment and how that links to a price tag for that treatment, there's a lot of concern about price to begin with. Add to that what we're seeing in terms of increasing patient out-of-pocket burden. Health insurance companies are changing their benefit structures. Patients have greater out-of-pocket expenditures, not only in terms of premiums, but in terms of co-insurance as opposed to co-pays. And so, patients are concerned and their advocates are concerned, and they're raising a lot of questions about the patient responsibility. And that's coming back and linking back to the notion of price. And then again, I think just there is an optics perception, a narrative, a headline around numbers. And we saw this very clearly with hepatitis C and Sovaldi being deemed the $1,000 per pill treatment. And every new milestone that comes up, whether it's Luxturna, will it be the first $1 million drug, creates a challenge of optics for us. But I think all of these three things combined lead to a really difficult situation if you're a biopharmaceutical developer with a treatment like gene therapy or cell therapy that's really breakthrough, that's really going to deliver high levels of efficacy. We can't necessarily follow the same paradigms that we followed in the past, and we have to be very careful in thinking about how we link price to value and then the overall narrative of price. So next slide. One good example of, I think, a company that has handled this well, is Spark with Luxturna, because there were a lot of headlines about the potential for the first $1 million drug. And I think Spark's leaders were conscious of this and were aware of this. And so when they did get FDA approval and rolled out their price tag, one, they brought it in under $1 million, which was important from the headline perspective. But two, as Ed noted, they did bring out a number of interesting programs, outcomes-based programs, discussions with CMS, patient assistance programs, et cetera, to help mitigate any concerns about that price tag, given if it wasn't over $1 million. And what you saw in response to that was really interesting. There were a number of articles that came out afterwards that lauded Spark for their approach to gene therapy, that really praised them for being sensitive and thoughtful about how they looked at this. And so I think that's one good example of a company that was conscious of the pricing environment, was conscious of the challenges that were coming through, and decided to respond accordingly. So I'd encourage all of you to look at that as a potential model and think about that as you develop your assets. Next slide. In general, again, I think you'll see this image overall. If we think about what impact the pricing sensitivity issue is going to have on market access for gene and cell therapies, it's going to be a challenge. It's going to squeeze all of us. And I think, as your commercial colleagues go through and seek to develop the price points, it's important for everyone to be conscientious of the pricing narrative and how we're going to be responding to it given the sensitive environment. The next issue that I wanted to bring up on the next slide refers to the overall conversation about budget impact. There's certainly concerns that the wave of innovation that we see coming to market is going to be unsustainable. And this quote comes from an ICER report around gene therapies, where they did a very quick back-of-the-envelope calculation saying, okay, if we treat 1 in 10 patients with a genetic condition and each drug that we use to treat that costs $1 to $2 million, the overall budget impact is going to be $3 trillion, which is exactly how much we spend on healthcare in the U.S. And those kinds of headlines and those kinds of estimates raise a lot of red flags and leads to a lot of scurrying around in the policy world about how we're going to deal with and absorb these costs. But I would encourage all of you to think about whether those estimates are accurate. That's a very simple way to look at drug development, drug costs, and uptake. And I think the reality is probably a bit more nuanced. We have a lot of failures in terms of treatments that come to market. The price tags certainly are not guaranteed, and the treated populations might be very different for every therapy. So I think the reality here is that that estimate is severely too high, but we don't have a better estimate yet. And I hope that in the next coming weeks and months, we'll see groups come out with some better numbers, because I think it's an important part of the debate around this concept. Next slide. As Ed noted, we have a lot of responses that are happening. I think even though we don't have a good number to pin to what the burden of budget impact will be, but from the UK and whether it's the HST program to New York State and its desire to manage budget costs, gene therapies and kind of high-value therapies coming to market being one of their many concerns, perceptions around affordability are really driving policy decisions. And so it's very important for us to be aware of the fact that payers, both at the commercial and federal and state level, are very concerned about longer-term affordability issues and are trying to manage those today. So in terms of what do I think the impact will have, again, it's going to just squeeze us a bit more. With the pricing concern combined with the budget impact concern is just going to continue to drive us to a point where we have to be very sensitive about what our external stakeholders are thinking about these products and their value. The final point that I wanted to make relates to the point that Ed raised around the U.S.'s approach to determining value. We have seen a really fascinating debate happening over the past 3 or 4 years about value assessment in the U.S. And it started in oncology with ASCO, NCCN, others. ICER came into the mix. We now have also entrants from Avalere and Faster Cures, a patient perspective value framework, and also one from a group called IVI. But the point here is that we're seeing a lot of activity in the space, more than I've seen in my 20 years in biopharma. And I think it really signals a need to link value and price together, and it signals a response that's coming from payers in terms of they need better information about the value of these therapies so they can understand what they're paying for and why. The next slide, we talk a little bit more about kind of what have we exactly seen in terms of this debate and where it's evolving. And I think the ISPOR report that Ed referenced, as well as other publications that are coming out more recently, are really driving for a quality-based approach to be taken in the U.S. when it comes to looking at value. We all have, I'm sure, very differing opinions about the relative value of the quality-based approach. I think it's a little bit challenging in some cases because, especially for rare diseases, the quality is not a great measure of value for a number of methodological reasons. But again, it's something that's coming to bear a bit more strongly than I've seen in the past, and we need to keep an eye on how it continues to evolve. In terms of ICER's role, the next slide highlights kind of what ICER has been looking at in terms of cell and gene therapies and how they've been viewing it. And I think the answer so far has been it's been an interesting mixed bag. So for Luxturna, they found that the cost per quality was higher than the recommended thresholds, and that relative to the WAC prices, the prices would have to be pretty significantly discounted to fall under the ideal cost per quality thresholds. Whereas for Kymriah, the thresholds, the prices were lower, and the cost per qualities were fine. At list price, they achieved being under the cost per quality, and you could actually increase the price to meet the threshold. But in both cases, ICER issued notes of caution, saying that while these treatments may or may not have relative value, these are very high unmet need populations. The exact dynamics of treatment were still remaining to be understood. So, they make these recommendations about the cost per quality, but is that really translating into hard and fast decision rules about who gets covered and what gets covered? Not yet. And I think, again, we'll continue to watch this space and observe how the quality is used and if it's used to make those hard and fast decisions, because it's a space that continues to evolve. So in terms of the overall, again, impact value assessment, it's, again, another squeeze for us between pricing, between the concept of budget impact and the concept of value. You know, we really have to be careful as biopharmaceutical developers and very sensitive to the external environment to understand what the concerns are and to try to figure out ways to respond to those concerns. Just to wrap up very quickly so we can take some questions, again, you know, I would encourage all developers in this space to really think about these three concepts, price, affordability, and value, as you develop your commercialization plans, as you consider your go-to-market strategies, because I think they'll continue to be important in the near term. And in the final slide here, just to summarize, you know, I think there's a lot of opportunities to watch how perceptions will continue to shift. We're going to get more curative therapies on the market over the next few years. We have to pay very close attention to the evolving landscape. And I think a successful strategy will involve striking the right balance between delivering a high level of quality evidence, making sure that you understand the economics, both of kind of your therapeutic area and of the general healthcare system as it continues to change, and a bit of expediency and luck. I think it takes, you know, a little bit of magic fairy dust, for lack of a better term, to make sure that you're able to get into the right place at the right time and try to figure out how to deliver a commercial strategy that is sustainable and manageable for all stakeholders. So I know we're almost out of time. Let me turn it back to Sophie, and hopefully we can answer a few questions that you may have.
Thanks, Prasoon. Thanks very much for that. And we are, as Prasoon mentioned, pretty much out of time. What I would like to do is I would like to do the final poll question, and it's going to come up on the screen in a moment. So the final poll question, there are three options. So the final poll question is, what are the main challenges for pharmaceutical companies with gene therapy reimbursement? So we've got the first one, which is talking about annuity payments, the second one, which is the one-time payment, and then the third one, which is pay for performance. And I guess if you have another idea, then that would be great to click through to other. So we're seeing the results coming through now, and as you can see, and maybe not surprisingly, certainly in terms of what Prasoon was talking about with value, is actually pay for performance seems to be coming up relatively highly. Actually, just looking at the screen now, it's sort of 3/4 of people are saying that pay for performance could actually be the ultimate reimbursement mechanism for gene therapy. And certainly from what Ed was saying and from what Prasoon was saying, it's not a clear environment at the moment in gene therapy and cell and gene therapy in the US, and quite frankly, I mean, I don't think it's very clear in Europe at the moment either. The question about how you actually link value and price together is something that many, certainly HTAs, have been struggling with for years. And for those of you who are familiar with what happened with NICE a few years ago and the whole value-based pricing discussion, they went back and forth on that one and still didn't end up with a concrete solution. So I think the area is very much still really evolving, and certainly in the future, I anticipate that there will be hopefully some more answers. From what we've seen today, certainly there are some more steps forward in terms of the insurance companies, in terms of what actually pharmaceutical companies are thinking about. And probably, I would say, you know, in terms of what we've been looking at today, it might be interesting in another 6 months to sort of look at, okay, well, what does this actually mean now? Have we seen any additional changes? Because from what Ed and Prasoon were both saying, there are many more changes that need to occur. So let me just pause here. I think what I would love to go through the poll questions. We're pretty much out of time. So what we're going to do, we're going to share all the results of the poll questions on our website. So everybody is going to be able to download those. You can download the recording and also the slides as well. I want to thank very much our speakers. And before I do, I guess just a quick question. We've had quite a few questions that have come through actually as we've been talking through. one of the questions just wanted to ask Ed and Prasoon, if we were going to be doing this and standing here in sort of April 2019, what kind of changes do you believe that we would expect to see in the US environment? Just as a final question to you both. So maybe Ed, starting off with you.
I think the big change will be that we'll finally get some notice from CMS on how we're going to deal with ASP and best price, because they want to connect value and payment, and the way they see it is they can't use qualities and dollars for qualities. They can't do that, but they can do outcomes-based arrangements, and if they're going to do that, they need to come up with a mechanism for it. I think it'll take a year, but I think we'll see it next year.
Fantastic.
I would totally agree with Ed's comments there. I think there's a lot of interesting things happening at CMS. I'm also really curious to see what happens in terms of innovative payment models in the next year. You know, I think that the notion of annuities is something that's been tossed around quite a bit over the past several years, but we haven't seen an example implemented yet. And so I will be optimistic and say that in 1 year we will have an example of a really different payment model that's implemented, even if it's done so in a pilot setting, that will really take us on the road to a different pathway for reimbursement of these kinds of therapies.
Interesting. So pharmaceutical biotech companies thinking more like finance companies.
Sure, why not?
Yes.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, thank you very much to our speakers today. It was a great panel. You've given us lots to chew over and think about. And as I mentioned, all of these slides and download will be available on the website. So thanks very much for joining. And any queries or questions, don't hesitate to contact us directly or via the Partners for Access website. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.